Hi, everyone. Welcome again to the Tipping Points webinar series, where we're asking questions that matter about how we balance conservation and development. And this webinar series is an initiative of the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation, and they usually take place on the last Thursday of the month. I'm Chris Trisos. I'm a climate change researcher, and today I have the enjoyable job of being the facilitator of the 19th Tipping Points webinar. And our focus today is around COP28 and how climate change adaptation seems to some observers to have taken a backseat to conversations about mitigation and the phasing out of fossil fuels that dominated a lot of the COP. And so questions we're asking today are, why is adaptation lagging? And what can we do about it? And I'm glad to be here with you and look forward to a productive and insightful discussion, and would ask you please to engage using the chat with questions you have for the panelists in the second half of the webinar. And so please be aware also that this session is being recorded. The good thing about that is it's available on the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation YouTube channel after the webinar. And this is also where you can catch up on other webinars in the series you might have missed. So to ensure you don't miss out on future webinars and other important announcements, we'd encourage you to sign up for the quarterly newsletter and stay tuned for the social media channels from Oppenheimer Generations Research. And mostly we're excited to just have such a good turnout today. So please continue to introduce yourselves and engage in the chat box, and don't hesitate to use it for questions you have throughout the webinar that the panelists will get to in the second half of the session today. So I am very pleased with that to introduce our panel of experienced scientists and researchers today. We have Laura Pereira, an associate professor at the Global Change Institute at Wits University in Johannesburg, South Africa. Laura is a researcher also at the Stockholm Resilience Center and a co-PI of the Future Ecosystems for Africa program. Laura is an interdisciplinary sustainability scientist who did her graduate studies at Oxford University in geography. And Laura is interested in the interface between traditional knowledge and innovation, the role of futures techniques in enabling transformative change, and knowledge co-production in the global South and specifically African context. Laura's also got a lot of experience sitting on the IPBES, Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, task force on scenarios and models, and is a member of the Earth Commission's Working Group 4 on transformation. So welcome, Laura. We're really interested to hear what you have to say. Another panelist is Peter Makumbe. Peter is the research manager at the Oppenheimer Generations Research and Conservation based at Shangani Holistic, a cattle and wildlife ranch in Zimbabwe. And Peter is an advocate for natural resource conservation, where his passion extends specifically to regenerative agriculture, emphasizing sustainable practices for ecological management. Peter is dedicated to bridging the gap between humanity and nature, emphasizing the importance of communities benefiting from their natural resources through sustainable use. Peter is currently studying towards a PhD in nature conservation at Nelson Mandela University, looking at migration patterns of male elephants in human-dominated landscapes. And then finally, we have Dr. Joyce Kimutai as a panelist. Joyce is a climate scientist with the Kenya Meteorological Service and a research associate at the Grantham Institute and Imperial College in the UK, where she works as part of the World Weather Attribution Consortium. And many of you might be familiar with their rapid attribution studies on climate hazards. Joyce's research has increasingly focused on understanding the role of human-induced climate change in weather and climate extremes, and raising awareness around climate risk among decision makers. Joyce also explores ways in which attribution science can support policy processes like loss and damage and climate litigation. Joyce has been a lead author of the IPCC Special Report on Climate Change and Land, and is currently the alternate IPCC focal point for Kenya and negotiates for Kenya at the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change COP sessions, including for items under science, review, and systematic observations, the global stocktake, and loss and damage. So we've got a real richness of panelists today, from those who are really in the practitioner research space, those who are in the policy research space. And so I'm really excited to hear what they have to say on our topic today. And so first, I'd like to invite Laura, then Peter, and then Joyce to start with around 5 minutes each on some insights on our webinar topic today based on your background and experiences. Thank you. Laura, over to you.
On so that I don't do the standard academic thing of talking for the next 20 minutes or so. So adaptation versus mitigation, it's sort of been the eternal question around climate change. I think it's an interesting point that's raised. And I think that particularly from the global south, from the African continent perspective, I can understand why it has been put forward. Because the emphasis of the previous sort of COP that we just came out of in Dubai, UAE, there was a big emphasis on the global stock take, which is largely around sort of what are the mitigation efforts, sort of how much carbon dioxide equivalent greenhouse gases are we actually pumping into the atmosphere, and what do we do about it? And obviously we know that, the more we're able to mitigate, the less adaptation we're going to have to do, right? So I think that's the other point, is that these aren't actually mutually exclusive. And so they shouldn't be sort of taken as sort of opposite ends of the spectrum. But we've also got to understand that, the entire sort of climate change community and the UNFCCC was set up initially around mitigation. It was to sort of call the world's attention to the fact that we have this existential crisis that we're facing, which is coming from the emission of greenhouse gas emissions, largely from fossil fuels, and that we need to do something about it. We need to mitigate. We need to stop this process, because otherwise it's going to take us on a really, really bad trajectory. And we also know the actors that need to mitigate is largely the wealthy countries, the global north, and those of us who leave the equivalent of those northern lifestyles. And so mitigation was the starting point. And I think that is a lot of the structures, the institutions have been set up around that. But as we were realizing that we're on a trajectory, that we were already alerted to this in the late 80s, right? But sort of very little action had been taken. We had moments of the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 coming through, and then sort of that being missed, and the Paris Agreement only coming together in 2015. That action hasn't been taken to mitigate. And so we're facing the really problematic scenario of needing fundamentally to adapt to climate change, and also to recognize that there's some things that we aren't going to be able to adapt to. And so we need to think about the loss and damage, and sort of what are the liabilities of this, like who has to pay for this. And so this is where adaptation started to creep in onto the agenda and has become a central focus of the global south countries that are going to be facing the effects. And so it's a critical equity issue in terms of what the emphasis of climate change discussions, and particularly financing, sort of goes towards. And I think you can definitely say that from a financing perspective, but also and Chris was largely involved in this in trying to unpack what these global goals and adaptation actually look like. We really haven't seen the commitments from the wealthier nations to actually understand the dire circumstances that sort of the global south developing countries are going to be facing from climate change, and that they haven't actually caused, right? And so this need for recognizing the need for adaptation, recognizing the need to finance adaptation so that we don't lose livelihoods, lives, our ability to sort of produce agriculture, our ability to fish, to feed ourselves, to sort of stay away from, avoid extreme events such as flooding, which we've seen play out in Cape Town sort of quite strongly, that we're not going to be losing sort of the key biodiversity that we rely on. All of these aspects is a critical aspect of adaptation. So that being said, you can understand why sort of the shift back to focusing on mitigation could be potentially be said to not be taking adaptation into account, that a lot of the strategies that we're seeing, which is not necessarily about stopping the key drivers of fossil fuel emissions, such as sort of consumption in the north, but is about planting trees or looking at how we're going to sequester carbon, that could actually be bad or maladaptation in many instances, particularly if we're looking at water abstraction of trees in sort of semi-arid areas. So there's a question that we need to be asking here. That being said, there was a recent talk that was given by Jim Skier, who's the new chair of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who said that, you know, going forward, actually adaptation is going to be front and center, at least of the IPCC's agenda going forward. And so I do think that there's a recognition of the need to keep adaptation critically on the table, but also recognizing that there's only so much that we're going to be able to adapt to, and that mitigation and wealthy countries stepping up and companies, individuals stepping up to the plate and actually taking on the charge still needs to be a fundamental part of the solution space. I think that was almost 5 minutes, Chris.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you for sharing those insights. And I'd remind those listening in the chat, please don't forget to drop any questions in the chat for our speakers. And we'll make sure to get around to answering those questions during the Q&A session after the presentation. So you can already start contributing questions now. You don't have to wait until the end. With that, Laura, thank you so much. I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Peter. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Let me also share my screen. Okay. Thank you, everyone, for this webinar. So I'll just jump straight into the discussion and debate. Okay. So as an introduction, just maybe to put everyone into the picture, adaptation seeks to reduce risk and vulnerability to climate change, strengthen resilience, enhance well-being, and the capacity to anticipate and respond successfully to change. Mitigation, on the other hand, means making the impacts of climate change less severe by preventing or reducing the emission of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So the two, they are interlinked in terms of how they work. So we don't treat them separately, as one of them influence the other. So you find that even from COP28, interest in the global response to climate change focused more on reducing greenhouse gas emissions to minimize the rise in average global temperatures. You find that adaptation and mitigation are closely linked, as minimizing temperature, for example, temperature rises will reduce the amount of adaptation that is required. But there is little doubt that adaptation is central to Africa or developing countries' survival in the growing climate emergency. So I'm just going to discuss here 4 points on why we need adaptation, or to balance adaptation and mitigation. So you find that we are already under threat. So immediate threat will demand immediate solutions. So many developing nations, especially in Africa, are already experiencing severe climate impacts like droughts, floods, declining biodiversity, and rising sea levels. Focusing on adaptation helps communities build resilience and cope with these present challenges, saving lives and livelihoods. While mitigation efforts ultimately benefit adaptation, their impact takes longer to be felt. So, for example, a recent report by the FAO shows that about 800 million people in Africa are already affected by moderate or severe food insecurity, and about 200 million of these are undernourished, and most of it is being compounded by the effects of climate change. Therefore, addressing the climate crisis is about more than just stopping new fossil fuel extractions and so on, or reducing pollution or mitigating the impacts that the global economy and so on. But it must also be about protecting basic human rights through climate adaptation. The second point that I will talk about is that we have got limited resources. So because of limited resources, we require strategic allocation of those resources. We find that many African countries have limited financial resources, and implementing mitigation measures is quite expensive, being about 10 to 20 times more than implementing adaptation measures. Thus, prioritizing adaptation is a good way of efficient allocation of those scarce resources. Mitigation, for example, accounts for the largest share of reported needs from 2020 to 2030 NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. It's about 66% of total climate finance needs, while its adaptation accounts for only 24%. So the balance really between climate mitigation and climate adaptation investment continues to be tilted towards mitigation. Adaptation is slowly losing ground to mitigation, as we found from COP28. The third point that I will talk about is that find that adaptation and mitigation can be intertwined, just like what Prof. Laura Pereira highlighted. So prioritizing adaptation ensures essential needs like food and water security are addressed, maximizing the impact of available resources. A better balance between mitigation and adaptation is needed. Prioritizing adaptation does not mean that we neglect mitigation, as this could lead to even greater costs in the future. So effective adaptation strategies often contribute to mitigation efforts. For example, investing in climate smart agriculture reduces emissions while improving food security. The last point that I'll talk about is about the localized solutions. So you find that adaptation strategies can be tailored to local conditions and community needs, ensuring more effective responses to the specific challenges faced by different regions worldwide. So as an example, at Shangani Holistic in Zimbabwe, where I'm based, we practice holistic management that allows resident regeneration and biodiversity conservation, using indigenous Nkone breeds that are more adapted to semi-arid environmental context. Helps create resilience during droughts. A mixed cattle and wildlife production system allows for optimal use of resources. So by practicing what we practice, we make sure that we conserve what we have. As a conclusion, expecting developing countries like Africa to achieve mitigation targets while concurrently sustaining struggling economic growth and formulating sustainable climate change adaptation strategies is as challenging as ascending a slippery, steep slope. With that, I'll stop. Thank you.
Peter, thank you so much for that detailed presentation, thought-provoking. I'd say, again, thank you to those who are already posting questions in the chat, some for Laura, some for Peter. Please keep them coming. Our panelists can engage in the chat that way, and also we'll make sure to get to those questions in the Q&A. Peter, thank you again. And next, Joyce, over to you.
So thank you so much. So today, just really trying to, so first, thank you so much for the interesting presentations from the two panelists that have spoken before me, and really just trying to sort of just put some of that information or those presentation into context. Is I just want to talk about why really efforts have tipped away from adaptation. And I'll start by highlighting an adaptation gap report from last year, where it's very clear that adaptation is really under-financed. We are under-prepared, and so it's really in the three areas of adaptation that this is happening. So it's in terms of the planning, it's on implementation, and on the finance. And what we see at the moment is the adaptation cap starts at around 194 to $360 billion. So there's really, that cap is widening. It's like we are starting to do really less on adaptation or invest on adaptation. And so really today, because I don't want to spend more time, I just wanted to talk quickly about, for 5 minutes, on why I think this is a problem. And I think one of the main reasons, one of the main issues I want to highlight in this presentation today, which I think is a problem that is contributing to this, is on sort of the imbalance in how we actually have been assessing sort of adaptation. So we know that as extreme events continue to increase, really, and we know that communities are continuing to suffer. We see sort of droughts happening, multi-year droughts happening in parts of East Africa. We see wildfires in parts of America, like Canada and Europe. And so what is happening with that is we see that if we don't continue investing on adaptations, it means inevitably we're going to experience continued losses and damages, and which in many cases is going to affect communities that are more vulnerable and who have less adaptive capacity actually to cope with these changes. And so then today, one of the reasons why I think this has been a case, and I think why we haven't been our progress on adaptation hasn't been as adequate, is because we currently do not have a framework or metrics to have a systematic assessment of climate impacts, or really have like a concrete sort of metrics that can be used to define, or indicators that can be used to define sort of concrete adaptation goals. And you find that there's actually an imbalance with mitigation. And that is reflected by the fact that we have a task force on greenhouse gas inventories that was established in 1998. And that has enabled us to have like well-defined, agreed upon metrics where we can actually measure emissions, we can hold countries accountable, and organizations accountable. So the fact that this is really lacking in the adaptation space means that it's really difficult for us to like sort of enforce sort of goals that we have, and sort of even the global good and adaptation that we've set, that was set by the Paris Agreement, means that it becomes really elusive. It becomes difficult to implement that goal. And so then I think what will be very interesting for us to do, or what I think can be a solution to this problem, is that we really need to equalize the evidence. I mean, I think a very key thing that is central to climate justice now is like looking at how we can fill that gap. And I think a first initial step really would be to look at how we want to equalize that evidence base. How do we want to see that what is important and what is necessary for us to do to those sort of develop indicators and metrics that can really make sure that within the global stocktake, when we are trying to assess the progress, the long-term goal, then adaptation is really on an equal footing with mitigation, right? So in such a way that we want to have a process where we know where we are, where we're going, what we need to do, so that we are on the right path to adaptation. And I think, to me, that is really one of the key areas for climate justice, because then if we don't do that, we continually experience these losses and damages and that are going to affect communities. And I think one of the other key points as well is on reforming sort of the architecture on financing. And what I see with that is that a lot of developing countries, their national budgets are dedicated to fighting poverty, providing health, education. And so really stuff to do with financing for adaptation becomes really not a priority for them. So there's a lot of competing priorities within these countries. And I think if we have an architecture that really, we get to talk about how they can access resources in a way that doesn't really burden their debt, and that can really support these communities to adapt better and to really implement the adaptation plans. And so then, as I close this presentation, I think we really need an authoritative voice, or sort of concerted effort in developing these metrics and indicators for adaptation. And I think one good place that can happen is really having a task force on adaptation and metrics. And that can be within the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for example. So where we have a task force, we have concerted effort, it's scientists coming together. It's an authoritative voice that we bring our minds together and we say, what do we need to do? What are the indicators? What are the metrics? How are we going to really talk about these gaps in adaptation, be it finance, be it implementation, be it planning? What do we need to do? What are sort of the metrics we want to develop? What are the ways in which we want to make assessment better, and then enforcing global good and adaptation becomes something that is a reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Joyce, and thank you so much for sharing those thoughts and some proposals for ways forward. Very much appreciated. I think now our speakers all did an excellent job of keeping to time and presenting ideas in a concise way. I see some questions coming in the chat. We'd like to see more coming. And for our panelists to engage with those, I'm going to, as the host today, start off with a couple of questions a few questions for our different panelists. And so, Lara, we'll start with you. I think, especially given your background in sort of transformations for sustainability research and futures research, it seems like, I wouldn't necessarily say stuck on mitigation, but we've kind of been stuck on this conversation of mitigation versus adaptation. Is adaptation getting its fair share of the attention and the finances for several decades now, perhaps? And you talked about seeing them in a more integrated way. And so we also talk increasingly about biodiversity and the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis being interlinked, and integration sought there. And then people say the same about, right, there's discussion on food, energy, water nexus and aspects of a pandemic treaty now, or pandemic agreement that is being discussed between countries, and the potential linkages between that and climate change as well. So the question I'm getting to here is, to what extent do you think a more connected world starts to address these problems in a more integrated way and sort of shifts us beyond this conversation? Or in the 2030s, in the decade of climate action, are we still going to be kind of stuck on mitigation or stuck on adaptation and having each section kind of try to fight their corner for the attention they think it deserves? You are on COP28 or at COP28 at the ground, kind of like, what's your hot take on how this evolves during the 2020s?
Solve the sustainability crisis, right, Chris? Basically. Sure. I mean, this is acknowledging that, yeah, as you point out, we're here talking about mitigation versus adaptation. The previous speakers have also sort of very rightly also brought up loss and damage, but we also know that these are not isolated, and that there are a lot of potential interventions that could lead to cascading negative impacts for biodiversity, for example. If we don't get mitigation right, we look at exceeding tipping points, for example, in coral reefs, that will have cascading impacts on fisheries and coastal communities' ability to feed themselves. So this is a broader sustainability question, and if we don't get our institutions together and our goals aligned and right, we are going to find ourselves potentially in the 2030s going around in circles, but just with a much more dire situation, right, that we're going to have to be facing, because we're going to be seeing the shocks that are hitting us. I was on a sort of commenting on a panel discussion for the Climate Change Action Group yesterday, and it was Professor Johan Rockström presenting the new Planetary Commons framework, right, which is the new next attempt of a governance infrastructure that tries to operate at the planetary level to recognize some of these key ecological infrastructures that we need to maintain in order to not sort of cascade into absolute chaos. So we're looking at the Amazon, we're looking at the West Antarctic ice sheet, we're looking at basically a lot of these sort of potential tipping points, which is why it's a very, very good name for the seminar series. And also Sir David King was on, we don't have our governance infrastructure set up to do this. So we sit here talking about an intergovernmental negotiation process because we know that this sort of climate change manifests at a planetary level, right? But none of our decision-making infrastructures are set up around that, right? It comes down to either domestic law, and even domestic law that then needs to get translated down into how cities function, how businesses function, how they can export their carbon footprints by sort of operating in other jurisdictions that don't have strict regulations. So without a complete reconfiguration of how we actually make decisions, yeah, I'm not sure whether even having a discussion on mitigation versus adaptation is really going to be the point at which we're going to start to solve the problem. That being said, we know we need to take action in all of these different domains. And I think that's the important conversation that needs to keep on happening, is we know whether it's around the biodiversity, the post sort of 2015 biodiversity agenda, or whether it's around climate, that we need to continue to have these conversations and set these targets, because we need an orientation of the action, of the direction that we need to go in. But until we reconfigure these broader governance structures, or really look at what the underlying economic drivers are that are actually landing us up in these situations, and sort of seek how we could break those, yeah, it's going to be a continual sort of conversation where I'm not sure that we're going to see the kinds of transformative interventions, right, that are actually going to get us onto a more sustainable and equitable trajectory. Doom and
Thanks,
gloom,
Lara.
sorry.
Thanks, Lara. Appreciate it. A strong plea for more integrated governance approaches, and I guess seeing climate change not as a kind of external glitch of development, but a transformation required in how we develop. Peter, over to you. I was really interested by a few of the figures you presented in your talk. One of them about adaptation needs, and so bringing that down to a local level. One of the questions that we had from someone who submitted on Eventbrite was asking around what best practices might be for reducing climate change impacts on specifically droughts on the livestock sector in Africa and semi-arid areas.
Thank you for that question. Yeah. So maybe as a starting point, maybe borrowing from forestry science, we need to do site species matching. So we need livestock breeds, to have livestock breeds in the proper habitat or proper conditions, breeds that are more resistant to the effects of climate change within that context. So it has to be contextualized. So for example, in Zimbabwe, we've got those breeds that have co-evolved with the changing climate, and those ones will be better for our context. So wherever you are in a semi-arid area, would recommend that someone uses breeds that are more resistant or that are more adapted to that particular environment. And then the second thing is that when bringing it to the context of cattle, for example, when we're talking about a cattle farmer, we're talking about someone who is a grass farmer. So you need to manage your grass, you manage your forage, and to do this, you find that your grass acts like your solar panel for photosynthesis. That's one that generates your money. So you need to make sure that you reduce ground cover, and that you allow lots of infiltration to hold more moisture. And how do we do this? As a case study, we use holistic management. It's a principle really that allows the cattle impact on your veldt to spread nutrients, to allow for infiltration into the soil, and so that you hold more moisture. And so if you have got so much moisture in your soil, it means that your grass, as a grass farmer, you've managed to grow as much forage as you would need to sustain you for the season. Because basically what you want is for your livestock to gain as much as they can during the growing season, so that when you go into the lean season, because most of the semi-arid areas, you've got a growing season where you've got lots of rain, and then a season where there is little to no rainfall. So it's important then that you manage your livestock during the growing season, and helping the infiltration also helps in recharging the groundwater and the recharging the rivers, so that you've got water. Because one of the problems in the climate change era is the infrequent rainfall or little rainfall really. And so having recharging the water, the groundwater, and recharging the rivers is one of the most important thing to adapt to the effects of climate change for a livestock farmer. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Peter. And I expect there might be some other follow-up questions for you in the chat. Thank you for that detailed answer. Next up, Joyce, another question on Eventbrite, and I'm going to add some things as well to it that I heard from your talk. So basically, it's in the context of climate change bringing serious changes in rainfall to many parts of Africa. And people have been adopting drought-resistant crops as one adaptation response. What do you think the limits are to that kind of strategy, and how might we move forward? And the way I would add to that from what you were saying is, in this adaptation conversation, are we risking a kind of setting up a barrier between adaptation and loss and damage as things that are kind of seen as separate areas of action where there shouldn't be overlap, and what your opinion is on that? Thanks.
Thanks, Chris. And I think that's a really interesting question. So I think really, I mean, it's clear now, like, but extreme events continue to pose like serious disruptions to livelihoods, right? I mean, and it's happening across many parts of our continent. And it's really requiring people to reconstruct, to transform, or to sort of shift their livelihoods, or even, I mean, if it's beyond, some are beyond diversification, and then it will mean shifting. And I'm just going to give an example of the Horn of Africa. This is where some of my research has focused on in the recent past. Is I looked at so there's a drought that started from October of 2020 to January of 2023. So these were 5 failed consecutive rainy seasons. And it resulted in the worst drought in like 40 years, right? And then subsequently in October, November of 2023, we had the region experience extreme rainfall, and it led to widespread flooding. Of course, the system was still very exposed. The system had not recovered at all. And this is what we see across many regions. So the regions, so the vulnerability, the adaptive capacity of the people or the communities or the systems, be it human or natural systems, have been continually their capacity of continually dampen, and these and so with the frequent extreme events happen, it means that they continue experiencing losses and damages. And so what one of that is that for these pastoral communities in Kenya, what's happening now is that they are actually continuously unable to sustain their livelihoods. And so just to answer your question is that I think really adaptation requires sort of a multifaceted approach. So not really just looking at one strategy, but looking at what other strategies can work or that are complementary, that can support communities in a way that they can continue to sustain their livelihoods. And I think for the pastoral communities, for example, in northern Kenya, we could talk about like diversification of food systems, for example, for them to shift from crop to livelihood production, just maybe as a buffer to recover from the losses that they've been experiencing. And I think also generating diversified livelihoods, for example, or is also something that is feasible or can be done to support these communities. But I think the most important thing is really engaging these communities to utilize their own local knowledge, their own indigenous knowledge, to see what is feasible for them, what can happen for them to continue sustaining their livelihoods, or really to continue sort of diversifying even the livelihoods to support them. And that really needs a lot of support. And so that's why we're talking about loss and damage, and we're talking about that funding for loss and damage that can support these communities, because you find that it's gone now beyond in some regions, or particularly in this region, for example, what I see is that the limits of adaptation have been reached. So, and in that case, you find that now it's about losses and damages happening to them. It's about these livelihoods no longer being sustained. And so then these communities really need resources to recover from this, to rehabilitate, to reconstruct, to see how they can diversify their livelihood to support themselves. Yeah.
Thanks, Joyce. We've got some questions coming in the chat, and we've got some time now for those questions. I think, Joyce, while we have you've just finished that one, there's a follow-up one asking about data gaps in Africa. And I know there's a lot of data gaps around attribution, so sort of monitoring climate hazards, sometimes around recording climate impacts. In other cases, there's actually perhaps the data gaps are much smaller than we think they might be. So what do you think are some of the reasons? Basically, are data gaps a big part of the reason that maybe research doesn't inform policy or policy doesn't translate to practice? Or do we have bigger problems than data gaps?
Yeah, I think data gaps is partly a problem, and but I really think I've started to think. I mean, having really worked on some of this work now, especially on attribution and trying to understand extreme events across the country, across the continent. Because literally every extreme event, when it happens, we are, as well with attribution, we try to see and understand how climate change is playing a role in this. And I think for the African continent, what has been a problem is trying to get the data that can really enable us to do these studies robustly. And but what one interesting strategy as well that we have employed that can support that sort of limitation in our work is also looking at vulnerability and exposures, looking at other factors that actually can sort of transform some of these hazards into disasters. So we want to understand what is the situation on the ground, how are the sort of the social structures, the governance structures that can support people to respond better to these disasters, or to adapt better, or to build their resilience. And one of the things that we are trying to do as well is to involve some of the communities in some of other projects or work that I do is involving the communities to understand how do they understand the environment, what are the so basically really having conversation and co-producing some of this climate information with them to see what can they do to adapt better to a changing climate, right? Or to build their resilience. What are the sort of strategies they can do? And an example is communities living in northern Kenya, even just using something as simple as water harvesting when it rains, so that they can use that water when for their livestock, for their plants when it's dry. So really just trying to see what are the very local solutions that can work for these people. Because yeah, we will continually say that we have data gaps, the models are not doing well. A very good example is the flooding that happened last year in parts of DRC and Rwanda. We couldn't find any observational data to help us really understand that event better. And the models are not replicating the event at all. Climate models are not really helping us to understand even that flooding that happened there. And so then if we continue saying, then if that is the case, there's nothing we can do. And I think that is going to be very detrimental for our continent. So I think there are more that we can do. And one of these very interesting strategies that we've put is, I think, is providing a solution.
Thanks so much, Joyce. Thanks for that really comprehensive answer. I think next we'll go to Laura. As someone who's based in a research institute, primarily based in one in South Africa, but also linked with one in Sweden. There's a question here from Eve around, given the challenges for Africa, sorry, the chat just moved on. I'll keep it again. Given the challenges for Africa, where are we? I think I'd rephrase it slightly as like, what is the role of universities, or how do we amplify the role of universities in kind of increasing focus on adaptation, meeting research and policy needs, perhaps even increasing implementation of adaptation, if you think a university should go that far?
So, I mean, I think the previous speakers and Joyce in particular sort of emphasized the role of information, of knowledge, of identifying the gaps that we have, but in particular, working with communities who are affected by these things on a day-to-day basis, right? And that's not easy work done at the global level, right? That requires sort of actual going down in the ground, building connections, building social capital, and that's, you know, not done with the wave of the wand, right? You need to sort of actually like have institutions, have those capacity, have institutions, universities, researchers in place to be able to do that. You know, it's not going to make any sense for me to run off to Senegal, right, to start sort of building connections with local communities there. You know, it needs to be expertise, capacity in country. And I think that's primarily at the African continent, a really important role that universities need to be playing, and that we need to be focusing on building those research capacities to do that kind of needed on the ground research, because that's where the impacts are going to be felt. That being said, from the science policy perspective, and I'm looking more at, you know, the enabling environment to allow for adaptation to happen, right? How are we actually channeling the finances that communities need to access? Once they know what to do, that's all very good and well, but, you know, academia is not going to provide them with the tools to then actually adapt, right? That needs to come from financing, it needs to come from other kinds of projects. That's a science policy interface. So it's about then also having enough expertise to be able to guide decisions to allow those necessary resources. You know, it's the same for mitigation, right? That I think there was an interesting PhD thesis that I read from someone at UCT that actually spoke to the very interesting role that the Presidential Climate Commission played in South Africa in terms of that brokering between science, between business, and between policymakers, right? In terms of like actually having a safe space to have the discussions of what is the science saying and why is it we need to act, right? So that's all just sitting very much at the African continent level. I think we also need to understand and realize that we love saying, oh, you know, capacity, knowledge gaps and capacity deficits and blah, 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 Africa. I mean, this is an international problem when it comes to modeling. We don't know how to sort of model adaptation globally, like anywhere particularly well, right? You know, we've got some of that, but I've got colleagues in the US who are working on exactly this issue, right? So this is not just an African problem. This is also a wicked science problem that we need to be working on how we can quantify things better for our models, how we can realize that maybe some things can't be quantified, that we need other kinds of mechanisms to help generate information that's going to be more useful for decision makers. I think science has done its job of alerting everyone to the fact that we face this existential crisis, that we know largely what we need to do, right? It's actually quite simple. We need to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And if we do that, then we're going to limit the amount of adaptation, et cetera, the other things that we need to do. The problem is that we haven't worked out the socioeconomic political mechanisms to enable us to sort of stop fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions. And so we're stuck with also having to solve the adaptation problem. And so I think science can also, as it always does, it's continuously evolving and merging and being more integrated in the same way that I was mentioning around the need for more integrated governance mechanisms that are cross-scale, multi-level, that sort of take different jurisdictional problems into account. Science needs to do the same thing in terms of its siloed behavior, in terms of sort of where resources are flowing to run which models, etc. I think that we also need to have an honest discussion on reconfiguring how we do our science for it to be more impactful.
Thanks,
and I
Laura.
think the North can learn a lot from the South in that. Sorry.
I agree. Thank you, Laura. Peter, we'll go to you next. And there was a comment from Karen Essler in the chat with a question at the end. And so what I'd like to ask you based on that is, what do you think are some of the needs in future research directions for adaptation in Africa? And you could say a bit about how this might translate to metrics and indicators or advocacy, but sort of where you see adaptation research needs in the next few years.
Thank you for that question. I think what I'll just amplify from what Laura has just said, that I think we need contextualize issues of climate change first. So maybe region by region, because I think the way we are being affected is different, you know, from region to region. So for example, if you check sub-Saharan Africa, we in terms of our contribution to climate change, like greenhouse gas emissions, very low, maybe less than 5% or so. But we are the most hit with the effects of the climate change, and we also have got little capacity to handle those effects. Then if you compare to the global north, for example, where there's more of these emissions, they've also got capacity to deal with it. So I think in terms of the future direction, the research and so on, is to able, to contextualize climate change, to say which regions are being more affected and which ones are less affected, and how should we channel maybe finances towards which regions and so on. So I think that so that we don't use a one size fits all sort of approach to say let's all reduce greenhouse gas emissions, or let's reduce coal use when some countries are using very little, contributing very little in that direction. So I think it's important that we have got that contextualization of climate change.
Thanks so much, Peter. If I could push just a little more and ask, in the livestock sector, which is important for so many millions of livelihoods in Africa, do you see particular adaptation needs or adaptation research needs in the next decade?
Yes, I think there is a great need within the livestock sector, and I think from some of the conference that I've attended in Zimbabwe when we're developing NDCs, it's about the data management. So our data management is very poor. You find that you get different statistics from different government agencies and from researchers and so on. So I think it's important that whilst we are doing research, it's also important to create a proper data management strategy that allows us, to formulate strategies, because we cannot formulate strategies without solid science and solid data management on the ground.
Thanks so much, Peter. We're coming close to the top of the hour now, so I'd just like to take this chance to thank those in the chat for insightful questions. I think we got to most of them in the time allotted. And thank you again to Laura, Joyce, and Peter for your valuable input and contributions to this conversation, and for lending us some of your time this afternoon. We know you're all very busy. And just to wrap up by saying, I think this conversation is going to be continuing for a while, especially as we get to the sharp end in this critical decade of climate impacts and action. And some of the trade-offs we have to make come into sharper focus. I think it's concerning that a lot of political discourse in developed and developing countries at the moment is kind of talking about maybe needing to go slower on transitions, when the science points to the need to go faster and in a more sustained way. And so I think this is a space we really all have to be active in, to make sure that we continue to advocate for progressive change that is evidence-based and picking up on what Joyce said, takes a perspective of climate justice, so that we don't leave anyone behind. And again, just to express my thanks to Laura, Peter, and Joyce for your time. Thank you all for attending. I've just been asked to mention that the next Tipping Points webinar is for the 20th of March, and it will be focused on the A to Z of South Africa's water troubles. And this webinar will be facilitated by Anthony Turton from the Center for Environmental Management at the University of the Free State. So please stay tuned for that. And remember, you can sign up for the Oppenheimer Generation's quarterly newsletter to stay updated on future events. You can find the link, I think it's been posted in the chat, as well as the social media, and that a summary of the webinar will be available on the website, and there will also be a YouTube recording. So with that, thank you so much all for your time. Really appreciate it, and have a good rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.